In 2036, Texas will celebrate its 200th birthday. But will its water, energy, and infrastructure survive long enough to get them there? Hello, listeners, and welcome to H2O and Beyond. My name is Alex Hahn, and each week we dive into the science, systems, and stories behind the water we use every day. Today's episode is actually a pretty special one. It's my first time interviewing someone who works in the realm of public policy. So, to help us understand how it all works and what Texas needs to accomplish before its 200th birthday, I'm joined by Mr. Jeremy Mazur, a representative from Texas 2036. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Mazur. It's great to have you on the show.
Alex, thank you very much for inviting me. Please call me Jeremy.
Sure. So, Mr. Mazur, before we start, I usually have my guests introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about, who they are, what they do, and the place they work at.
Yeah, well, thank you. My name's Jeremy. I'm the Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy at Texas 2036. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, data-driven policy organization. And our North Star is to make Texas the best place to live and work by the time of our bicentennial, like you said in our introduction, in the year of 2036. And so we work in a variety of areas, including housing, healthcare, workforce development, public education. My area involves infrastructure and natural resources. And this includes energy, climate resilience, as well as water, what I call essentially the lifebloods of Texas. And so we engage with stakeholders and policymakers on the policy changes we need to make Texas a better place. A little bit about me. I came to Texas 2036 after working over 20 years, both in or with the legislature, frequently on matters relating to water policy. I worked in the Texas House, Texas Senate, and also as the Director of Government Relations for two agencies that are important to the state's water future, the Texas Water Development Board and the Railroad Commission of Texas.
So, before you came to Texas 2036, were you or is the word like a politician where you were elected to the Senate and House, or were you doing something different?
No, I was not an elected official. I was a staffer in the Texas House of Representatives. I was a chief of staff for a state representative from the Houston area that played a pretty key role in developing our state's water policy during the 2000s. And I was also a legislative director, deputy chief of staff in the Texas Senate for a state senator from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And that's an area that has significant water infrastructure challenges, and we frequently worked on water issues when I worked there.
I see. And so, for listeners who might not be familiar, like me, for example, I know almost nothing about public policy. Could you explain to me like what goes on at Texas 2036 and what exactly you guys plan to do?
Well, a lot of our work involves doing a lot of data-driven research to identify what the policy contours are of certain policy problems we have. And we'll talk about water. We look at the data, we look at the research to see how could we accurately describe what the state's long-term water infrastructure challenges. And based on that research and based on that data that we work on within our organization, we develop policy recommendations that we share with additional stakeholders as well as state leaders and the legislature for consideration on what could be done on the legislative and policy level to address these water infrastructure challenges we have in the long run. So coming back to Texas 2036, Alex, of course, we do a lot of work in data-driven research. We do a lot of work in stakeholder and media engagement in terms of sharing and describing the data that we're seeing about our water infrastructure challenges. But we also do what we could call essentially lobbying, where we engage with state lawmakers and legislators to try and pass legislation that address our long-term water infrastructure challenges.
I see. And yeah, I saw on your website you guys describe yourself as a think tank. Is this exactly what a think tank is?
Yeah, I think tanks come in all sort of different shapes and sizes. I think we have our own unique shape and size here at Texas 2036, insofar as we're a nonpartisan, data-driven, research-driven think tank. And I think what's really unique about us is that we try very hard to take our data-driven research and use that to drive meaningful policy change in the state house here in Austin.
I see. So you guys are able to work with, both political parties or yeah, people from all sorts of political parties because you guys don't have a bias and you guys only use data-driven analysis.
Absolutely. And we feel that's very important, where
Mhm.
when we're talking about the big issues that Texas is looking at, not only with regard to water and energy, but with regard to workforce
Yeah.
development and housing, public education, it's important to have reasonable, common sense, data driven discussions about what the challenges are and what are the common sense solutions that we can arrive at towards fixing them. And what we find is that in this era of increased political polarization, there is a strong appetite among policymakers to want to do the right thing, to
Mhm.
fix the long term problems and to deliver solutions for their constituents. And so that's why we oftentimes have a significant amount of success in talking with lawmakers about what needs to be done to make Texas better in the next 15 years for our bicentennial celebration.
Yeah, I think the one thing they can all agree on is data, which you guys are the ones doing the research and doing all of that. So I think using data-driven analysis really can help bridge the two political parties together to work and solve Texas's issues.
Absolutely. And I think when we look at some of these issues, particularly with regard to water in Texas, honestly, there's not a Republican or Democratic policy approach to water in Texas. A lot of the policy debates about water in Texas are really about where's the water coming from, who's going to benefit from it. The debates aren't partisan here, but they're rather regional, where you have certain regions that are concerned that their water is going to go benefit people in another region. That's the nature of the water, oftentimes the nature of the water debate in Texas. And again, it doesn't break down into Republican or Democratic policy lines. It's all regional.
I see. So everyone's just, across like one region of Texas might want like they might be scared that, another region might be using their water. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think that's a fair high level characterization of a lot of the debates that we oftentimes see. There are concerns about building pipelines to pump groundwater from one part of the state to the benefit of residents in another area of the state. There are oftentimes very harsh debates over the development of reservoirs in certain parts of the state where that water would be again used to benefit residents and businesses living in other regions of the state. And the same is true with regard to the use of water in our rivers, lakes, and streams, where people are oftentimes worried about pumping water out of a river in East Texas, which
Mhm.
is oftentimes a water rich area of Texas, and pumping that west to the more drought prone arid region of Texas to help out communities over there. And so there's oftentimes big debates in our state about groundwater use and exports, reservoir development, and what we call interbasin transfers. We pump water from one area of the state to the other.
And I heard you guys just had your legislative session in 2025. And could you tell our listeners like what exactly a legislative session is and what gets accomplished at one?
Yes, Alex. So the Texas legislature is somewhat unique insofar as that it meets once every 2 years. And so we had our most recent legislative session earlier this year, and they meet for only about 140 days. And so during this 140-day session that began in early January and ended in early June, the legislature had to process over 9,000 different bills filed in the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. And so we meet every 2 years for 140 days, and there's a lot of big issues that come up during these 140-day sessions. This year, certainly the budget was a big issue. Property tax relief was a big issue. There were also some other substantial debates on some social issues. But what was really exciting about the 2025 Texas legislative session was that it was in every way a historic water infrastructure funding session.
I heard like this is different from Georgia, where I think our state's legislative sessions happen once a year, and because you guys only happen every 2 years, does that sort of push you guys to want to enact bigger bills, sort of like make bigger changes every time since you guys only do it every 2 years?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. I mean, does the fact that every 2 years we meet just provide greater impetus to do bigger and better things in
Hmm.
the following session? I think every session of the Texas legislature that I've worked in since 1999 has always had big issues. We've had budget sessions, we've had tax sessions, we've had public education reform sessions, we've had disaster response sessions after some severe hurricanes have hit the state. I think we find that every session oftentimes has its own headlining issues, and there's different reasons for that. Oftentimes, there were some big events that happened in the year prior to the session that really galvanized state leaders in the legislature to want to make these issues big for that given session. And I think what happened in the years leading up to this year's session, there were a bunch of high profile water infrastructure stories that really made water infrastructure investment one of the top issues for the 2025 legislature.
And was one of these big issues, the July 4th floods that happened this year, was that something that was hotly debated?
So it was interesting that you mentioned that. I think the regular session that
Hmm.
started from early January to early June really focused on the issue of reliable water infrastructure. What we're talking about there, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, Alex, the need to expand and diversify our water supply portfolio for a drought prone and growing state, the need to address and fix aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems that are becoming liabilities to the communities that they serve. I think those were the key issues that the legislature looked at during the regular session earlier this year. And we thought after June, like, okay, everything is done with water. But then something terrible happened in the early morning hours of July 4th, where a unique weather formation dumped an unbelievable amount of rainfall in the Texas Hill Country, causing the flooding of several river basins. And as you no doubt have probably heard, over in Atlanta, over 100 people, including many small children, were killed in these horrifying, devastating floods. This disaster event prompted Governor Abbott and the legislature to look into disaster response and flood protection during a series of small special sessions that happened later in July and August. And so there were certainly some changes that the legislature made later this summer during a special
Hmm.
session relating to disaster preparedness and flooding. But I think that's separate and different from why the regular session earlier this year was such a big water infrastructure session.
Oh, I see. So you guys are able to host special sessions if something big comes up. Is that the purpose of the special sessions, or?
Yeah, special sessions can occur for different reasons, Alex.
Mhm.
I mean, sometimes they can be in response to an emergency, as we saw with the governor's response to the July 4th disaster.
Mhm.
Sometimes the governor will call the legislature into a special session because an important piece of legislation didn't pass during the regular session. And the legislature really needs to make sure they pass that bill so the gears of state government can keep turning. Then other times there's sometimes some other reasons why the governor might want to call a special session, such as wanting the legislature to focus on a specific issue that was not necessarily passed during the regular session. And the reasons for this vary.
And the July 4th floods, they're such big news. I was actually out of the country during that time. I was in Taiwan, and I turned on the TV, and it's the first thing I see. It was like, I think it was a one in every 100. This happens like once every 100 years, and you saw the waters rise 20 feet in a few hours, and it was terrible.
Yes, it was a phenomenal rainfall event. And there's a famous saying here in Texas that oftentimes guides our water infrastructure development. And it was said about 100 years ago that Texas is the land of perpetual drought visited by the occasional biblical flood. And certainly what we saw in early July was a flood of biblical proportions, and the destruction that it wreaked within those river basins was catastrophic. But we've seen this happen before. We've had similar rainfall events, such as in 2015. There was a huge rainfall event just south of Austin that devastated the town of Wimberley along the Blanco River. And then in 2017, the entirety of the city of Houston, well, almost the entirety of the city of Houston, was submerged due to Hurricane Harvey. And so floods and severe flood events are certainly part of the Texas experience. And so we have our planning and financing infrastructure to address that. But another big part of the Texas experience, Alex, has to do with drought. Again, we are the state of perpetual drought. And a lot of our infrastructure planning focuses on what do we need to do to build the water supply we need for the next long, severe drought.
So I see your policies mostly focused on preventing what has happened in the past before. So if you have like this giant flood, you would try to push a policy that would increase flooding to better your infrastructure. Is that what you guys do?
Well, I think what we would want to do, I mean, certainly in flooding, I think a lot of the focus is on what do we need to do to make sure there's investments in place or funding in place to build the flood protection infrastructure we need to protect communities and human life from future flood events.
See, and what about drought? How do you guys push? What are your policies relating to drought? How do you plan to address that?
Well, drought has really been one of the key North Stars for state water policy. It's been this way since the 1950s when Texas went through what was called the drought of record. And this was a long, severe drought that lasted between 1949 and 1957 that really had a lasting impact on the state's political economy. And it was this drought that really began the migration and transformation from Texas being a rural agrarian state to being a state where a lot more economic activity is centered within our cities, such as Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. But the 1950s is that's when the state began to it did several things. First, it created an agency focused on water supply development. That's called the Texas Water Development Board. And it also required that the Water Development Board begin developing these state water plans. And that process kicked into a more advanced gear in the late 90s that inaugurated the current state water planning process that uses regional input to develop a statewide water plan that projects what we will need in terms of water supply development in order to survive a repeat of a long, severe drought like the drought of record. And so a lot of the state water policy focus over the past few decades has certainly been on making sure that we have the regulatory framework in place, plus also the financial framework in place to build the water supplies that we need to prepare ourselves for the next long, severe drought, similar to the drought that we saw in the 1950s.
By building water supplies, do you mean like diversifying your water portfolio or?
That's a great question, Alex. I mean, when we talk about building water supplies in Texas, that means a lot of things. That includes building reservoirs, although that's easier said than done these days, or drilling new groundwater wells. But oftentimes when we talk about building water supplies, it involves this huge array of other things that we can do, such as water recycling and water reuse, water conservation, which is a really big thing, certainly in San Antonio and El Paso, desalination of seawater, desalination of brackish groundwater, and even something called aquifer storage and recovery, where we sometimes pump water underground in these banks where it can be available for future beneficial use.
Yeah, I know in Houston, they're actually trying to build a desalination plant there right now, right? Is that?
Yeah, there is I think there's some ideas for some plans in the area, but I think that the bigger controversy right now is in the Corpus Christi region, where there was a major seawater desalination plant that's been proposed that's just been put on ice for the time being. And so we don't know if they're going to be moving forward with that seawater desalination project.
See, and the process of creating these bills, how does it from like start to finish? Can you walk our listeners through that?
So creating so working, so the bills in the legislature happen for multiple reasons. And so oftentimes, a legislator will, all bills are written by state legislators. And so they're written by a state representative or a state senator. And how they happens for different reasons. Like sometimes they may be talking with a constituent, and the constituent will talk about a certain type of policy problem. The legislature writes a bill to fix that problem. That's one way a bill can be introduced. Another way a bill could be introduced is a legislator works with stakeholders from different communities to develop a legislative proposal that becomes a bill to address, to address certain issues or problems. And so what we saw this past session was that there was significant stakeholder input with regard to the need to have reliable, dedicated funding for our long-term water infrastructure needs. And several bills were filed and ultimately passed this session that essentially create this new framework in Texas for funding water infrastructure, thanks to these bills that were introduced and passed earlier this year.
By stakeholders, do you mean like residents of different areas? Who are these stakeholders?
Stakeholders, sometimes they can be residents, but what we also saw is when we were talking about water funding, the stakeholders involved a pretty broad, diverse coalition of chambers of commerce from across the state, business and trade organizations from across the state, different organizations representing the water industry in different sectors of the water industry in Texas, and even nonprofits like Texas 2036 that were engaged in supporting this effort. And so these were a lot of the stakeholders that came together to help provide some of the impetus for passage of these bills.
I see. And so Texas 2036, you guys' job is basically to, go to these legislative sessions, give your present your research, and then, will the senators and House of Representatives, will they sort of like edit their proposals based on the things that you guys said? Is that correct?
That is entirely their prerogative. I mean, they are the ones with the magic pens that decide what stays in a bill and what goes out of a bill, or how a bill could be amended. That's how this process is supposed to work. And so, yes, when folks testify before a House or Senate committee, like we did during this past session, we would have recommendations on tweaks that could be used to make the bill better, or not necessarily to make it worse, but like how everyone goes to testify on what they think could make the bill better if needed. And yes, it is the bill author's right and discretion to make those changes based off of public feedback, and that's oftentimes what we see during the Texas legislative process.
And I think in our previous meeting you mentioned that Texas actually does things a little differently, in that in order to, I think, pass laws you have to amend your constitution. Is that right?
No, not necessarily. So we have a state constitution, and some things require amending the state constitution for different reasons. And so not every bill that's passed is an amendment to the Texas Constitution. In fact, a broad majority of the bills every session are not necessarily constitutional amendments. But you do amend the Texas Constitution oftentimes when you're proposing a really big shift in policy change, especially when it comes to the use of public spending and taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, no, I think you guys have one of the largest state like one of the longest state constitutions. I think I saw it on Google somewhere. But yeah.
Yeah, it is several hundred pages long. I think there's 16 articles in it, and some of the sections in there date back to the late 19th century.
Mhm.
And there's if you read through it, it's got some interesting stuff in it for sure.
And so you guys with your water infrastructure bills, that sort of stuff doesn't tend to require amending the Constitution, right?
Not always, but there was a major piece of legislation from this session that does propose amending the Texas Constitution to dedicate a portion of state sales taxes to the Texas Water Fund. The only way you could create this dedication of sales tax revenues to the Texas Water Fund is by amending our state constitution. And so that was a bill or resolution that passed earlier this year. And in order for that resolution to become law, state voters have to have a say on it later on this November. And so one of the big discussions in Texas right now is all about Proposition 4 that proposes to amend our state constitution to create this $1 billion per year state sales tax revenue stream dedication for the Texas Water Fund.
And I remember I took some notes, and you guys recently passed HJR 7 and Senate Bill number 7. I'm sorry, I'm not really familiar with those letters. Can you?
Yeah, it's well, what they stand for, Alex, is HJR's House Joint Resolution 7. That was a resolution that proposes to amend the Texas Constitution, and this is a big deal not only to the Texas water community, but I think it's worthwhile for your listeners in other states to take note. And what we're proposing here is this $1 billion per year state sales tax revenue dedication to the Texas Water Fund. And this will provide reliable, consistent funding for Texas long-term water infrastructure needs that includes developing water supplies, fixing aging, deteriorating systems, and building flood protection infrastructure. So that's what House Joint Resolution 7 did. The other bill that you mentioned was Senate Bill 7 or SB 7. And SB 7 doesn't amend the Texas Constitution, but rather it amends the Texas Water Code to instruct how this new dedicated revenue stream will work moving forward. And so the legislature has required that if Proposition 4 passes, then at least 50% of this dedicated revenue be used for expanding our water supply projects, and also provides greater funding eligibility for funding agricultural water conservation projects, water reuse projects, as well as funding for rural and disadvantaged communities.
So HJR 7 and HB or no HJR 7 and SB 7 they're both related? Is that?
Absolutely, they are related. So what we need to have happen is if HGR 7 passes this November, then that triggers Senate Bill 7 to take effect later on this year. It's kind of a Texas two-step, if you will.
So when listeners see like I saw the number 7 on both of these, does that automatically mean like the two bills are related? And
I think they're related in substance, but there's the numerical link there, the two sevens, was entirely coincidental. I've never seen coordination like that between the House and Senate chambers before.
okay, and how are things like before you guys proposed this? What prompted the need to take taxpayer dollars and create this fund for water infrastructure?
Well, we already have the fund. What this
Oh,
does,
okay.
it creates a funding stream for water infrastructure. And the reason for this interest was I think there's broad recognition among state leaders, such as Governor Abbott and the state legislature, that we have several water infrastructure challenges. Again, as I said before, the first is the need to diversify and expand our water supply portfolio. And the second challenge has to do with fixing these aging, deteriorating, leaking drinking water and wastewater systems. The data pointed out that insufficient or unreliable water infrastructure could really become a liability or a downward drag to the state's economy in the long run if we don't have reliable water infrastructure. And so I think that the legislature and state leaders they recognize, like, if we want this thing called the Texas economic miracle to continue, where we're seeing rapid economic growth and expansion within Texas, especially within the Texas triangle between Houston, DFW, and San Antonio,
Mhm.
Austin, we need to make sure that there's reliable water infrastructure in place. And if you do not have reliable water infrastructure in Texas, then you really do risk having businesses and families just go somewhere else instead of staying here.
See, and so, the only way to have this reliable water infrastructure is if you can have this, reliable funding from the taxpayers, right?
I think that I think that's a core piece of the logic here, where if you have reliable, dedicated funding going to the
Mhm.
Texas Water Fund, it will provide consistent funding where we can start building these water infrastructure projects we need, including water supply projects such as water treatment plants, pipelines, desalination plants, water reuse, and also fixing a lot of these aging, deteriorating systems. Alex, I was talking with a mayor from East Texas
Mhm.
earlier today, and he told me that they just had to spend several $1 million repairing a trunk line, which is a main arterial for our drinking water system
Mhm.
that was over 120 years old. And so we have a lot of systems that have these old, antiquated parts in place, and they're leaking, and there just needs to be a lot of investment to replace them so they can be more reliable in the long run.
Sounds like, if HJR7 and was was it Senate SB7? Was that the one? So if, both of these pass, it would allow the taxpayer dollars to, from now on be used to help support water infrastructure in the future. Is that it?
That nails it. Yeah, you got it.
And you said they vote on the residents vote on HJR7 in November, correct?
That's right. The big vote that's coming up on November 4th
Mhm.
is on Proposition 4, which is essentially HJR 7. And so this is the proposition that dedicates sales tax revenues to the Texas Water Fund.
And if HJR7 gets passed, how long do the residents have to vote again to pass SB7?
No, if HJR 4, sorry, if Proposition 4 passes this November, this revenue dedication will last for about 20 years. And so what this means is that up to $20 billion will be going to the Texas Water Fund over the next 20 years. Uh, and we don't know what will happen after in 20 years. I mean, a future legislature could decide to continue this type of revenue dedication. But the good news is that we have something reliable and consistent in place should Proposition 4 pass this November.
So HJR7 passes, SB7 automatically passes as well. Is that it?
Yeah, there is a bit of a cause and effect there, Alex. So if Proposition 4, that is HJR 7, passes, then Senate Bill 7 does pass later on. That does take effect.
I see. And other than trying to solve the issues relating to drought and floods, what else has Texas 2036 been keeping an eye on for the future?
I think there's a lot of interesting issues that Texas has to deal with. I mean, we're a big state. I'm sure you've probably heard everything's bigger in Texas, but we're not the biggest state. We'll admit that. But we're experiencing rapid, aggressive population growth and economic growth. The saying here goes is that a lot of people and businesses are moving to Texas, and they're not bringing their water or electricity with them. And so this causes a significant amount of public policy challenges that we're looking at here at Texas 2036. How do you provide enough electricity for a growing state, especially when we see an expansion within energy intensive industries in the state? How do we make sure that our public schools, institutions of higher education develop the workforce that our employers need in order to be successful and productive in this state? And then there's other issues that we're looking at with regard to, like, making sure housing is affordable, insurance is affordable, and even beyond that, there's questions regarding healthcare that we're looking at as well.
Yeah, I think was it Houston's done a great job at reducing their groundwater reliance so that their land doesn't sink. Which listeners, if you listen to our one of our past episodes, we actually did cover. Is Texas 2036 doing anything relating to groundwater management?
We've not done anything specific with regard to groundwater management yet, Alex. But one thing we do think about groundwater management when we look at it from a statewide policymaking perspective is that we need to make sure that we have accurate science and data in place so that we can accurately measure how much groundwater we have and how much groundwater we're using in Texas. They're doing this very well in the Harris Galveston area, especially within the confines of the Harris Galveston subsidence district, who I know
Mhm.
you visited with a couple of weeks ago. But we still need to develop this science and data development across the state so we can have more accurate, effective measurement and management of our groundwater resources.
Oh, I think yeah, this makes sense now because I remember they mentioned like in that Harris Galveston area, they have like these like satellite stations and they have all this over there, but I guess the other parts of Texas aren't so developed yet in terms of that technology.
Yeah, there's some areas in Texas, and I mean, there's a Harris Galveston subsidence district, but also the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which is just to the south of us here from
Mhm.
Austin, has very extensive, advanced, sophisticated measuring technology for the Edwards Aquifer in the San Antonio area.
Yeah, I think this does go back to how data driven you guys are, making sure you have accurate data before you guys present any of this to the legislature. So I think this really does build trust in what you guys do here at Texas 2036. I see you guys are really set on having accurate data.
Mhm. Absolutely, I think that's, and there's a public appetite for accurate data. I
Mhm.
think, not only between policymakers, but also, just what we find from the public at large. I mean, we have a substantial outreach with our newsletter and media outreach. And a lot of people subscribe to our newsletters because the data driven policy takes that we provide on all these key issues affecting Texas is something that people want to read about.
Different areas of Texas experience different problems. Do you guys, sort of like how politicians go, they go around to, different states to campaign. Do you guys go around to, different parts of Texas and, sort of meet with the residents there to see what their needs are? Do you guys do something similar to that?
We do that. I think, a couple of things to note, Alex. Like, first, we have a board at Texas 2036 that comes from different areas of the state. We have board members from, Austin, Dallas, and Houston, but also from Texarkana in far northeast Texas and El Paso, which is all the way out in Mountain Zone in Texas. So I think that board, our diverse board, helps provide some valuable perspective with regard to our policy work. But we also go across the state and we visit with stakeholders and communities in different areas to learn about what their concerns are, what they think, could be some reasonable policy solutions. uh, Case in point, in a couple weeks I have to go to Northeast Texas to Longview to participate in a pretty big panel conversation about water. And so I'm looking forward to being there so we can hear more about what folks in East Texas are thinking about their water resources.
You said East Texas tends to have an excess of water. Is that, or they tend to have more water than the drought prone West?
Yeah, that's typically the rule of thumb. I mean, there's a lot more, first, like, there's generally a little bit more rainfall naturally in East Texas than there is in West Texas. And that, combined with the vegetation and the humidity, really allows for water resources to be a little bit more plentiful in East Texas than they are in West Texas. Now, West Texas, keep in mind, it's hot, dry, arid. There's a lot of sand and dust, and so West Texas topography and geology doesn't necessarily lend itself to the maintenance of surface water resources like we can see in East Texas.
And is it just all drafting proposals and research until the 2027 legislative session? Do you guys do anything else in the interim?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, now that the legislative session is done,
Mhm.
and we have to see what voters do with Proposition 4 in about a month from now. I think there's some other water issues that we want to look at Texas 2036. I think, one of the big questions the legislature wants to look at is how do we effectively manage our groundwater resources? I think we want to also look at how could water markets play a key role in managing water resources locally. And so we do a lot of our work over the interim to help develop the data sets and the reports that we will use to inform the policy discussion, hopefully in the 2027 legislative session.
I don't think I, specifically asked like you, what, like you do. Are you like one of the researchers? Are you one of the people that, reach out to residents? What's like exactly like your role within Texas 2036?
Yeah, I'm the director of infrastructure and natural resources policy, and so I think as the title sounds like I direct the policy, and this involves a lot. I mean, in terms of doing the research, writing the reports, engaging with different stakeholders, engaging with the public, also doing media interviews and sometimes podcasts like this. But I've also testified before the House and the Senate on various issues. I've presented the findings from our reports. I've testified in support of bills. And so if you ask Alex, like, what do I do? It's really a jack of all trades when it comes to working for water for Texas.
Um, I want to ask, how accessible is the research you guys do at Texas 2036? Will residents be able to follow up with your progress as you guys discover new things?
Absolutely. We make all of our research and all of our reports available online, and they can find it at Texas 2036. That's TEXAS 2036.org.
And since you guys are in the realm of public policy, public support is obviously huge. You guys rely on the residents for Proposition 4. Is there any other way for residents to get involved with what you guys are doing at Texas 2036?
Thank you for that. What I would recommend is, visit our website at texas2036.org. And I think the best way to start is just you sign up for a newsletter, which we send out typically every week, and we'll give you a data-driven download on what some of the key policy issues are affecting our state.
I see. So you guys actually publish this every week, like your new findings every week, and like sort of an update on what you guys have been doing in your
Yeah,
newsletter.
absolutely.
And, for residents of other states, are you familiar with like sort of any other nonprofits like Texas 2036 in other states?
I haven't had a lot of experience with
Mhm.
similar organizations in other states, but I know that certainly I would regard California as one of our peer states when it comes to water management. It's a big state, a drought stress state, and absolutely there's plenty of organizations out there that are working on water resource management, uh, and certainly also in the Southwest as well. I think one in particular that we like working with is called States for the Future, which is an organization that collects that kind of works with organizations like Texas
Mm.
2036 from other states on what are the policies that we need to put in place to make sure our respective states are resilient and robust for the decades to come.
Oh, I see. So you guys at Texas 2036 actually work with other states as well, as correct?
Yes, certainly through the States to the Future organization, we do.
What is states with through the future, like, is it a California only thing, or
It's not California only. I think when the last meeting I went to was in Arizona,
Mhm.
and there were certainly representatives from Arizona and California, Texas, I think Tennessee, Florida, but I think a lot of different policy, or Georgia, a lot of different policy folks from different states came together for that meeting.
and as we sort of wrap up this episode, Mr. Vase, I want to ask you, like, what's been like your most like interesting proposal that you're working on, like, or have worked on? What do you think is the most interesting thing?
Well, Alex, I have to say that it has been an honor and pleasure working with state leaders this session to
Mhm.
get HJR 7 and SB 7 across the finish line. I think thanks to this legislative leadership, the fact that we have this reliable, dedicated funding for water is going to be a big deal for the Texas water sector. And I hope your listeners from other states take note. And so going back to your original question, like what's been one of the biggest things I've worked on, I've been really proud to work on, it's certainly this effort.
How long have you been, working on proposal number 4?
We've been working on it for about over 3 years. I think there was a series of reports that we released about 3 years ago that kind of floated this idea, but it's certainly been over the past 2 years we saw accelerating interest in this proposal that we and some additional reports and data that it really kind of kicked into overdrive and became a real proposal.
And when it passes, do you guys throw a party at Texas 2036 or?
We haven't thought that far ahead yet. There's a famous saying in Texas politics that you either run unopposed or you run scared. And so I think we're making no assumptions about what's going to happen in November. I think we need to, I think the message needs to be shared with voters about what Proposition 4 actually does.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe if we do get a successful vote on the evening of November 4th, I think we'll maybe go out to lunch the day after, like that.
And for residents to find accurate information about proposal number 4, is this information's all available on your website? Is that how they can find out?
Yes, absolutely. We have a webpage also available through the texas2036.org website, where you can it provides a little bit of more information about what Prop 4 does, but also provides some links to the research and reports that we released last year that helped inform the policy discussion on why we need dedicated funding for water.
And if residents have other concerns, do you guys also have a spot where residents can actually contact you guys and share their concerns?
Absolutely. I think that's also available on our website.
I see. And as we wrap this episode up, are there any last words you would like to share with our listeners, Mr. Mazur?
Thank you, Alex. First, thank you so much for having me on. I think what you're doing here with H2O and Beyond is a wonderful project. I saw your other episode with the Harris-Galveston Subscience District. Thank you for putting this together to share best practices between other states and water practitioners. It's a great idea. I think the only thing I'd want to say to the voters, your listeners, is this certainly was a big water legislative session in Texas. Keep your eyes peeled on what happens in November's election. But I think also more importantly, if Proposition 4 passes, there's going to be a strong interest in seeing what taxpayers get from this dedicated funding. And so I think the conversation will then focus on how quickly and how efficiently are we developing the water supplies and fixing the water systems that need fixing using this dedicated funding. So we'll see what happens starting in 2026.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Mazur, for joining me on H2O and Beyond today. It was a pleasure having you, as a guest, sharing with our listeners, what they can do and what you guys do at Texas 2036. Thank you so much.
Alex, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Well, listeners, if you found this episode helpful, please share it with your coworkers and friends. And if you want to be a guest on the podcast or have any episode suggestions or feedback, there'll be a Google form linked in the description for that. And also, I'll also link the resources Mr. Mazur mentioned in our description as well if you guys are interested in helping out and supporting what Texas 2036 does. And make sure to check out our link tree as well in our bio to stay connected with all our H2O and Beyond socials. I'm Alex Hahn. Thank you for listening to H2O and Beyond. Stay curious and stay hydrated.